Welcome to our ABA Criminal Justice Section, CLE, using data as a tool to drive racial justice. My name is Melba Pearson. I am one of the vice chairs of the ABA Criminal Justice Section, as well as the co-chair of the Prosecution Function Committee. And I also serve as the director of policy and programs for the Center for the Administration of Justice, housed at Florida International University. This afternoon, we have an action-packed panel discussion on what it means to really use data as a prosecutor and to use data towards making sure that our system is fair and equitable and that people are experiencing similar outcomes no matter where they are from or what their background is. So what we'll do, we'll start off with some introductions. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their roles, and then chat a little bit about how they came into this data sphere, right? Like, how did they become a convert to data is the wave of the future? So I will start first with Aisha Edwards. Can you please introduce yourself, your title, and tell a little bit of your connection to data?
Hello, everybody. Aisha Edwards. I am a program officer with the MacArthur Foundation. And though I am at the foundation now, I spent about a dozen years working as a criminal law attorney and trial attorney in Cook County, first as a prosecutor and then as a defense attorney at a local legal aid. I actually ended up going back to school because I started to see that working on the system one case at a time was not a real way to have impact. So I went back to school to get an MBA. And I realized I learned a lot there that was directly applicable to criminal law, but in a new capacity, actually working on criminal law reform as opposed to just one case at a time. I learned things like those closest to the problems have the solutions. I learned the importance of diverse and collaborative input to get buy-in and important solutions. But I also learned the importance of using data and analyzing data and aligning metrics for your performance metrics, aligning them with what really matters to stay on mission. And so those things kind of led me to criminal justice reform at the foundation, where I get to incorporate these things. And these are all incorporated in the work that I do at the foundation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aisha, and welcome to the program. Next, and I'm actually going in order of my screen. So, okay. So next up, we have Professor Besiki Kutaladze, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Melba. You're one of the very few people who can pronounce my last name. Who would even dare to pronounce my last name? Thank you for that. My name is Besiki, and I'm an associate professor of criminology at Florida International University, as well as a co-founder of the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators project. We'll be talking about this a lot today. Prior to coming to FIU, I was the research director at the Institute for State and Local Governance. And prior to that, I was the research director at Vera Institute's Prosecution and Race program. So my background is in performance measurement and evaluation. Before focusing on the US legal system, I did more work with the United Nations in Liberia and Haiti. Thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Besiki. Now, next up is State Attorney Kim Fox from Cook County.
Thank you, Melba, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this great panel. I am the state's attorney here in Cook County, which encompasses Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. We are the second largest prosecutor's office in the country, behind Los Angeles. And prior to taking my role as the state's attorney back in 2016, I, like Aisha, was a line assistant in this office for 12 years. I, too, was handling case by case, feeling a sense of frustration of whether or not I was actually really having an impact, and honestly seeing a pattern that was anecdotal around how we were treating certain people, whether based on where they lived or based on where they went to school, and being incredibly frustrated that there was not a mechanism by which we could see the impact that we were having. Was my courtroom handling cases the same way that a different courtroom was? Was it dependent on the judge? Was it dependent on the prosecutor? That level of frustration led me to leave and run or to work for the president of our county board, who was working on criminal justice reform. And so I led our criminal justice reform efforts on looking at racial disparities in the system and really wanting to do more in terms of pushing the prosecutor's office, who is the gatekeeper of our justice system, to be more transparent in how we look at cases and outcomes. I eventually ran for the office and won, and was immediate. One of the first things that I did was to say that we had to embrace data and transparency in a way unlike my predecessors and many others had. And so we established the first open data portal here in Cook County, and I believe in the country, where we put every piece of felony case level data on an open data portal so that researchers, academics, my staff, folks can come in and see it. And what we knew that there might be good, bad, and ugly things that the data would be able to reveal, but we wouldn't be able to do anything if we didn't know where we were starting. And so I believe, I was a very early convert, that you cannot fix that you cannot measure, that you cannot really start asking the questions, which is why I was really excited to be a part of Bezeki's project. The data allows you to ask another series of questions to get to some of the fundamental answers that you're seeking. But you can't get there without having that baseline. And so I'm an early convert and very excited to see data being embraced in the criminal justice space, which so much bad policy has been driven by anecdote as opposed to data and facts. So thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least is Andrew Warren, State Attorney for Hillsborough County here in Florida.
Melba, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to the ABA for setting this up today. My name is Andrew Warren. I'm the state attorney in Hillsborough County, which is based in Tampa, Florida. I was elected in November of 16 and reelected in 20, so I've been here a little over 4 years now. By way of background, I was a federal prosecutor. I had never actually worked in the state attorney's office that I now have the honor of running before I was elected. I spent my career as a prosecutor, first prosecuting street crime in Washington, D.C., and then prosecuting complex financial fraud all over the country for the Justice Department. I had the opportunity to move back to Florida with DOJ a few years ago and ended up running for state attorney because I had seen so many problems in the criminal justice system and didn't want to be just a spectator as the country was having a conversation, frankly, for the first time in a generation, about problems in criminal justice. I wanted to help shape that conversation, not just in my community here in Tampa, but across the state of Florida and across the country. And when I talk about the problems in the criminal justice system, very broadly, what we're talking about is that the system had lost focus on what its goals are supposed to be. Over the past generation, it had taken on a singular focus of punishing people, of incarceration, seeking maximum sentences, and prosecutors patting themselves on the back as if they had actually made the community safer, when we know that it was perpetuating mass incarceration, the revolving door of criminal justice system. It wasn't solving problems that we see come up every day. So my whole approach here over the past 4 years has been a problem-solving approach. How do we make our community safer? How do we reduce crime? How do we assess the impact of what we're doing on people and on a defendant's family, and on a community? How do we steer kids away from the system? How do we embrace treatment for people who suffer from substance abuse and mental illness? There are so many goals that we should be focused on. And what we realized, as my colleague Kim said, you can't start to fix a problem without being able to understand it. And that understanding comes from the data. So we have embraced data-driven solutions from the beginning to try to really get into the weeds of what's happening in our court system, to make sure that we are achieving the outcomes that we are supposed to for our community, making sure that we are keeping our neighborhoods safe, that we are being consistent in what we do, that we are promoting fairness and justice in every single case we handle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And so before I pivot now to sort of like mini presentations from the different lenses of each of the panelists, I just want to remind everyone that this is a panel for CLE credit. So you will have to watch consistently and continue to click on the prompts in order to be able to get CLE credit. I will be announcing the code for you to input to get your credit at the conclusion of the right before we go into the question and answer section of this panel. So first, I'm going to pivot to Becky to talk a little bit about the genesis of this project. So how did the PPI project came to be, and walk us through what the PPIs actually are.
Thank you, Melba. With great pleasure. So, if you ask me what I did the day before yesterday, I probably will not remember, but I know exactly when the idea behind this project started. And it started in Liberia in 2008. As I said, I was doing the work with the United Nations there, trying to convince local stakeholders to build more transparent and just, accountable, diverse criminal justice system. And diversity there mainly was manifested through the gender diversity in the police force. But it was an incredible time in my career that exposed me to all kinds of challenges of post-conflict peace building and then criminal justice system building. And I remember vividly meeting with then the Chief Justice of Liberia, Johnny Lewis. And in serious number of times, and trying to convince him to adopt empirical measures of the rule of law to assess the performance of the judiciary and the prosecutor's office and the courts, broadly speaking. And at some point he was, I'm just so persistent, and I guess that's Georgian in me, and sometimes borderline annoying. At once he looked away and through the window and then turned back to me and he said, basically, maybe there are some good metrics in the United States of the prosecutorial or judicial performance that we should be considering for adoption in Liberia. Touche, obviously. The man has gone to Yale Law School. He knew exactly what was happening in the United States, way more than what I knew at that point. And he basically called us on the hypocrisy without sort of naming, giving us the adjective. Because we do know the United States goes to many countries and then preaches the world how to be more democratic, fairer, more accountable, more transparent. And sometimes we don't do those things really well back at home. So since 2008, I've been thinking about this and, took some great partners, the right timing, and incredible funder who would believe in the idea of developing new metrics, because this is not a small project, right? It does require the input from the communities, then the reporters, and the prosecutors, and then researchers, and requires the sites. You can come up with the best possible idea and best possible measures, hypothetically speaking. But if you do not have the data for those ideas and for those metrics, that's completely useless. And let's be honest, until Kim started sort of publishing the data on the public-facing dashboard, there was not much of the prosecutorial data available. In fact, I was giving the interview to Washington Post yesterday, and they were asking me, who put the first dashboard out and then sort of the most important sort of development in this field? And then Kim, I had to say you. I really had to say it's a Cook County, because not only it was the first effort of this scale, but it's also not only the dashboards, but raw data, case level data that is unprecedented, and redefine the standards for this work moving forward. And I exploit this when I go to convince new prosecutors to do this work. I was like, hey, look, there are other jurisdictions do that. And most of them are not aware about this. And then I had to pull some dashboards from Andrew's office, and then Kim's office, and then John Chisholm's office, and Melissa Nelson's office, and show the specific examples, because people still don't believe that things like this exist. So long story short, took several years to get the sort of the concept articulated better. I convinced my good friend Don Steeman, who is the scholar from Loyola University, Chicago, to join this initiative and help me sort of convince the sites and convince the funder to invest a significant amount of resources into this project. So, and then Andrew, you would remember this better than I do. In 2016, we met in Orlando, perhaps. So the when must have been
2017.
Was it 2017? 2017, we met in Orlando where Kim, Andrew, and Melissa Nelson from Duval County, Florida, were just elected. I mean, Fair and Just Prosecution, our good friend Miriam Krinsky organized a meeting in Orlando where we started to talk about this. And as much as I want to take full credit for this brilliant idea of prosecutorial performance indicators, it really went through the stages and then phases of getting the feedback and everyone contributing. I mean, we made our state attorneys come to these meetings twice a year, spend 2 days to start thinking about what to measure, how to measure. We got a lot of input from all kinds of groups, and we piloted the tool in 4 jurisdictions. So I neglected to say that the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators is a project that started in 2017 in partnership with these 4 brave, brilliant prosecutors. Brilliant because they, prosecutors and data don't get along. And when you talk to the prosecutors about the data, you hear typical things like, hey, I didn't go to law school to become a statistician, or data are going to bias me because every case is unique. Did you not know? And if I start considering trends on unique cases, then I'm going to be making biased decisions. Or you'll hear things like, yeah, you're measuring racial disparities, but you can never really account for everything we're considering when we're making the decision. So your analysis is useful, but really, is this really a reflection of the actual decision making? So there are all these conversations that you are having, and it's also not always politically beneficial. To start this project, these people had to blindly agree to publish data. And this is now, we're talking about 4 years ago. Even 4 years ago, this was unheard of. Today is difficult. But ever since, they helped us establish the standard. Right now, going to the new jurisdiction, and we have now 8 partners. And Melba, at some point, you will discuss who the partners are? Yes. So, and as we launched this project and the website in October of 2020, we've had 28 jurisdictions express their interest in doing this work. And we developed a clear standard right now. We're not going to be working with the prosecutorial offices. 1, if they are not committing to publishing the data. And 2, if they are not committing to allowing an external group. It doesn't have to be us, but it has to be an external group with some credibility, both methodological, but also political credibility, to do the racial disparity assessment and publish the report. No matter how bad, how unpleasant, how upsetting, the report has to become public. We were in the midst of negotiations with a number of jurisdictions, and then we basically, it didn't happen because making that kind of commitment is still very, very difficult. So fast forward, 3 years later, from the launch of the project, and the most important contributor to this project is, and this person is not here, and I'll just have to say this, is Lori Gurjuki. Lori Gurjuki from MacArthur Foundation, who really believes that the prosecutors can and should play a bigger role in bringing about meaningful reforms in the United States. So the MacArthur Foundation in 2015, Aisha, correct me if I'm wrong, 2016, launched the Safety and Justice Challenge. I remember out at the table. It's an incredible initiative that is focusing on reducing unnecessary incarceration and racial disparities in the nation's jails. And as part of this Safety and Justice Challenge, we knew that we needed to build a project that had a strong prosecution component to it. And so the investment was made, the first investment in 2017. And since then, Lori Gurjuki and Aisha Edwards have been incredible thought partners, to the extent that we have regular meetings where I get yelled for things that I do right or things I do wrong. And we have incredible sort of these are not just funders. These are people who do understand what's happening nationally, what it takes to take these reforms on as a elected prosecutor, sensitivities and then communications component of it. And there have been tremendous support in terms of articulating how to shape our model. I guess that's a much longer than what you wanted to hear, Melba, but I warned you.
In case y'all don't realize, Besiki and I work together. So
yes.
this is what our day-to-day looks like constant banter, which is why I love my job. But anyway, so that was a really great introduction to what the platform is about. I'm going to turn to Aisha, and then we're going to return after talking to the state attorneys and Aisha and talk a little bit more about the dashboard itself and just sort of like that process of what it takes to put one together and how it kind of changed the game for certain jurisdictions. So Aisha, pivoting to you, tell us a little bit about your work at MacArthur and, why you think data is so important. And it was so important for MacArthur to be at the table for this particular project.
Well, thank you. And Besiki actually queued up a lot of what I do at the MacArthur Foundation with the Safety and Justice Challenge, where I spend most of my time. And the Safety and Justice Challenge is an initiative to reduce the misuse and overuse of jails and to eliminate racial disparities across all the front end decision points that are pathways into jail incarceration. So we have 51 jurisdictions that have participated, about 26 of those in a very deep way. And we partner with several organizations to provide support to those jurisdictions, ranging from general project management support to how to authentically engage your community as a part of criminal justice reform. And so we have a bucket that is focusing on the sites and building support for them. And we have a bucket that is focusing on amplifying messages of what we've learned. And then we have a third bucket that focuses on generating new knowledge about what it takes to really make a difference in our goals of reducing jail use and eliminating racial disparities. And so our support for the FIU Loyola PPI project falls under our knowledge development. And I think that was the main thing I wanted to say about that, but I wanted to add, you said about the importance of supporting prosecutors. And again, I can't take the credit for this project because it was already in motion when I joined the foundation, but I was all too happy to sign up for it because it was very near and dear to my heart. Thinking about helping to change the way prosecutors address their work was something I thought about daily as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney. So I was very happy to be part of this project.
Great. Thank you, Aisha. One more question for you before I pivot to Kim and Andrew. What does this work look like nationally? Has there been a trend towards data, or are we still in the infancy stages of using data in prosecution, or are we further along than we may realize?
Well, nationally, I'd say that to be part of an initiative, you have to be about embracing data. That's a necessary prerequisite. Some lessons learned that we try to encourage now are to make sure you have partnerships with community and people who have lived experience early on and bring them into the conversation, and to have an intentional focus on race. So that's one of the reasons I'm really excited about this pilot, because it already has that baked in at the outset. We actually released a report through ISLG, who is our performance metrics partner for the Safety and Justice Challenge. It was just released last week. And it highlighted for the first 3 years of the initiative that our sites really did make a difference at reducing their jail population, some as many as 40%. And of course, Kim Fox's office was a huge part of that. But what we did learn, so the report celebrates those wins, but it also reflects on some lessons learned. And while we did reduce the harm for everybody impacted by the jail system, including Black and Indigenous people of color overall, the disparities between groups actually did not change, and in some places they actually increased. And then just another reminder that if you don't go in with the intent of making a difference and making sure affecting racial disparities is part of the intent in what you're doing with the data, that you can't do it indirectly. I think a lot of our sites were initially hoping that it would happen indirectly, and it wasn't. So it's another reason why this learnings from the pilot is so important about having that at the outset. No, did I answer your question?
Great. Thank you so much for that, Aisha. And so before I pivot to Kim and Andrew, I want to definitely set the table with, one particular data point, right? So this project started in 2017 with 4 pilot sites. So Kim and Andrew were part of the brave new world, being a part of this pilot. And the other 2 offices included Milwaukee County, which is John Chisholm, as well as
Melissa Nelson,
Duval. In Duval, Jacksonville. And we expanded the project to include 2 more sites, including Philadelphia, which is Larry Krasner, and Scarlett Wilson over in Charleston. We're working on bringing on a few more sites as we speak. So wanted to kind of set the table with that because of the fact that Kim and Andrew were in this very unique position of being trailblazers in the world of prosecution and using data in this form. So turning to you, Kim, what was your experience going through the PPI project? And, was it surprising? Was it easier than you thought, harder than you thought? Walk us kind of through your experience, please.
The experience was, I think, a little harder than I thought, because as I said, we had embraced data coming in and, putting our data on the dashboard. I think I had thought we'd gone through a lot of some of the growing pains that other prosecutors' offices are going through. There is a lot of hesitancy to put data out there, particularly when you are being intentional in talking about race. Conversations about race and justice and race and prosecution in 2017 here in Chicago was deeply personal. I was elected in the wake of a murder of a young man named Laquan McDonald, and policing and law enforcement was under a tremendous microscope. Is eerily familiar to where we see ourselves as a country now in the wake of George Floyd's death. And in that attention where people were saying, well, what is the role of the prosecutor? There was a lot of frustration with my predecessor. So when I said, we're going to share this data, I think anecdotally, if you went to our jail, you would only see Black people and some brown people and very few white people. And so I think if you went in our courtrooms, you saw that largely the people who were defendants were Black and brown. And so when you say, well, I want to share, let's look at the data, let's start asking these questions, there was an initial defensiveness, a defensive posture that comes with our assistants who come into this work because they want to be, agents of change in their communities. They want to be advocates on behalf of people who have been harmed. They're looking at the victims of violent crime or other crimes who are also Black and brown. And so the notion of talking with intentionality around race and your role in the process, there was some hesitancy. There was some, well, what does this mean? They're in the work of prosecution. I think as Aisha mentioned earlier, and I keep going back to you got your one case and you kind of feel like you're not part of some big systemic problem. I just got my case. And what bringing data to bear would demonstrate that there probably is a systemic issue here. So that was some of the hesitancy that I was surprised by. Because we had embraced data, it was talking with intentionality around looking at race that I think caused a lot of trepidation with the men and women in our office who, again, public servants who want to do good, who are now going to have to tackle with systemic or institutional racism, and the institution is ours. So that was some of the initial hesitancy. And so there was a lot of work that we had to do to talk about this. The project, anything involving data in academic institutions has surveys and questions. And, there's a bit of fatigue around that. And can I be anonymous? Like, what does this mean? All of the things that you're talking about, the prosecutors are like, oh, do I want to do this? Introducing this to the staff, because that's where the information was coming from. We had to be delicate. We had to be thoughtful. We had to, one, embrace this as this was meant for good, bad, or ugly to make us better in our work, to make us more credible in our work. But the credibility that the justice system was suffering from here in Cook County was because we didn't have answers, because people would go off of just what they saw anecdotally. And so that surprised me, though, that there was that trepidation and hesitancy, but I got it. I understood it, that we have to have these conversations with real intentionality and recognize, because we haven't for so long, if ever, that the defensiveness will come as a result. But once our folks got into it, it's the thing that I said earlier, it started to allow us to see information and ask more questions. When we looked at, for example, dismissal rates, we saw that the dismissal rates for white defendants were much higher than they were for Black defendants. And so then you start asking the question, if you're truly just one case at a time, well, how is it showing up in this way? And what it did, it led us to see that more white defendants were being offered diversion. And so the question is, if you have a standard for who gets diversion, how does this disparity then show itself? Again, data forces you to ask the next set of questions. And then what we were able to see was that, well, some people weren't eligible for diversion because of their criminal background or arrest history. Well, then you start asking questions around, well, in certain neighborhoods, policing strategies are different, and therefore you may see a higher prevalence of arrest in Black neighborhoods that you might not see in white neighborhoods as a result of policing strategies, absent totally what we get. And again, everything we get comes from police. And so then that starts to ask the question, well, should we change our standards for diversion so that we can, with intentionality, as Aisha said, deal with the disparity, to not simply accept that the disparity exists and say, oh, I get why it exists. The next question is, how do we tackle it? And I think looking at the data, having that investment from our folks and getting them to buy into, we do actually have to tackle it. It is not enough for us to say, well, those are policing strategies that lead to these outcomes. Well, now it's on our desk. And now we have to be accountable to the public. It's public. And the person who lives in Inglewood, who sees that people in the Inglewood neighborhood are not getting the same diversion rates as someone gets in Lincoln Park, isn't going to want to hear my excuses about policing strategies. It's, what are you doing, prosecutor, to do something about it? And so that connection between ownership of our role and accountability to the community that we serve has been one of the biggest, I think, takeaways from this, and why I encourage prosecutors across the country to do that, because it forces you to be accountable to community and be self-reflective of your role in the institutionalized aspects of race.
So what, if anything, surprised you about the outcomes of the dashboards?
I think the surprise was, I think we knew anecdotally going in, that we saw a lot of people of color in our system. It was the difference in treatment. It was, again, we all assumed people were being treated exactly the same, only to find out that you saw this disparity from this, what seemed race neutral policy. And so that was the surprise, I think, from our line assistants, because you give the feedback to them as well. They don't know. They really are my one case, I'm just a cog in part of this bigger machine. So I think the surprise was, here's the disparity, right? Here's the cases that as they come to us, our outcomes are different. And that, I think, for many folks was a bit jaw-dropping, because there was an assumption that there would be a race neutral outcome, when in fact it wasn't, because people were assuming, I don't see this. I'm not looking at this like, oh, I have a white defendant, I'm absolutely going to treat him better. Like that, no one was doing that, I can assure you. So when you had the data to say somehow we're doing that, that was a surprise for our folks.
Yeah, I mean, Kim, you really hit on a great point around the fact that you may be acting in a race neutral manner. You're coming in with the best of intentions, but the outcome ends up being, having disproportionate effects on certain communities versus another. So we have to, if we don't measure it, we can't fix it. So thank you so much for that. Andrew, pivoting to you to just hear more about your experience in the PPI process. What sort of bubbled up to the surface for you? What surprises were in store, or were you not surprised at all?
Sure. So I think for our office, this entire project has been a relaxing and calming experience. And what I mean by that is I had to tell everybody to relax and calm the hell down because people were panicked from the beginning. And I'll talk about it in 3 groups. We had sort of my executive team at first, which was thinking, you agreed to do what? You're going to show all this data to people before we know what it means and before we've been able to vet it. And at first I said, don't worry, because this was back in 2017 when Besicki sold us on this project. I said, we're going to be using data from before any of us got here. So it's not going to reflect on us. Little did we know that it would take like 2+ years to get the data out. And it certainly is our data, and it does reflect on my administration. But there was also a piece of it where we had to calm down my ASAs. The assistant state attorneys here, like Kim was talking about, we had prosecutors who were worried that we were going to be using some Google-esque algorithm to tell them how to do their job. And that, of course, was never the goal behind it. And it was such a key part of the internal work that we did to get people on board by having them actually sit down with Besky and his team and learn about what it is that we were going to look at. Because we know that prosecutors aren't sitting around and saying, how do I handle this case in any other way than what I think is the best thing to do in this particular case based on what the laws and the facts are and the victim. But when we take those cases outside of the silo in which the prosecutor operates with them, then we can get a much more holistic look at what we're actually doing as an office. And having prosecutors buy into this is going to be good for us, not because it's going to tell you how to do your job differently in a case-by-case basis, but because this is going to arm us with information so that collectively we can do a better job in furthering a mission that you all believe in. That was important. I think the third piece of it too is frankly with regard to the community. We had people in the community who had heard me talk about data-driven approaches and transparency and the idea that being transparent and open builds trust at a time when levels of trust are strained, to say the least, between the community, especially our minority communities. And when the community saw the data and started seeing the data that we were going to put out before the actual numbers came out, there was a lot of confusion about it. There was an expectation by some groups that we were going to come out and say, yep, we're all racists. Got a lot of racist prosecutors and we do a lot of racist things here. Our apologies. We also had people who thought that the solutions were going to just magically appear in the numbers. Yep, we have a diversion problem where we have white defendants getting off for diversion more often than black and brown defendants. Here's how we fix it. And it's not that simple. The data gives us the power to ask more questions, to find more information, to start to identify the
Okay, I think we have a mild technical problem, so hold that thought. I will pivot now to, well, when Andrew comes back, we'll continue with his answer. But what I can do for the time being is pivot back to some of the other questions that I had for the panel. And now for everybody watching, I see all these amazing questions coming in. Stay tuned. We will answer all of them. Just give me a few more minutes to get through a few more of the questions that really set the table around this topic. And I will answer every single question that came in. All right, so Besicki, if I could have you talk more about the indicators themselves and the process by which this analysis is done when we go into a new site.
Absolutely. So I think what a great. I mean, you understand now. I'm so thrilled to be working with this group of individuals, right? You know, just you don't have to even explain why you would need data. Like they're doing all this work for us. I don't know why we're even getting paid, for God's sake. Like, you know, we just need more of these people in this criminal justice system or legal system, whatever we call it these days. I think one of the things that prosecutorial performance indicators do that I want to stress is bringing new values and ideals. So while it's a office management and performance measurement and evaluation tool, it also introduces the ideas that are not necessarily embraced across the prosecutorial offices. That historically relied on conviction rate or sentence lengths or crime rate or recidivism measures or prior arrest, as Kim was saying. That's exactly my point. It made me think about, how prosecutors heavily rely on prior arrest. Even if that prior arrest didn't result in conviction, for somehow we are using that for subsequent unrelated cases to make more punitive plea offers or to make divergent decisions differently when there is an idea of presumption of innocence. If that arrest didn't result in conviction, how can you disadvantage somebody for subsequent cases? But even if it did result in conviction. So I think there has to be a reconsideration of how prosecutors have been relying or over-relying on prior record when they're making the decisions. And that's not going to be an easy discussion. We know a lot of states also rely on sentencing guidelines that are heavily relying on prior record, but some honest discussions and data-driven discussions need to happen on those issues. And some reforms are sorely needed to, to become much more thoughtful about how we are considering prior record as we're making subsequent decisions. Andrew is back. Melba, do you want to go back to Andrew? Because it was such a great point he was making.
Yes. Andrew,
Okay.
the floor is yours, and then Besiki will pick back up with the indicators.
I'm sorry about that. My IT team knew that I was about to criticize them, so they just played before I got me. Just to wrap up that thought, I was talking about making sure the community understood how we were using the data, that the solutions were not obvious to us, but that it was giving us the power to dig deeper into a problem, to really focus on the issue, to understand the data at the most granular level we could, and then to start finding solutions from there. And this goes to the presentation of the information back to the public. There are some people in our community who really want to understand the difference between diversion rates and the completion of diversion programs between different minorities, which is a relatively nuanced point. There are other people in our community who just want to understand how many cases we prosecute a year. So we had to find a way to present data that was both meaningful to the community and at the same time was helping us to answer the questions that were sparked by the project in the first place, which is improving what we do every day as prosecutors and as people trying to keep our community safe and promote fairness and justice in the system.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. Besiki, back to you. And you have to take yourself off mute, though.
Yes, thank you. So I was saying that the one other thing that the prosecutorial performance indicators does is introduces this new ideals that we want prosecutors to start embracing. We know that public safety, community health, well-being, those are important ideals for the prosecutors to measure their performance over time. But we also want to have the measures of racial and ethnic differences, minimizing unnecessary punitiveness, prosecutorial ethics and integrity, how prosecutors are working with community groups, as well as time and resource prioritization, things that we have not traditionally used to gauge the impact we're having. And just to go a little back to what Kim and Andrew were saying, yes, prosecutors are thinking about their success in terms of the unique cases. If I'm making the best possible case or unique case, then cumulatively, my decisions or our office-wide decisions should be good. And unfortunately, that doesn't work that way. Prosecutors get promoted to the division chiefs or the directors or bureau chiefs because they're good trial lawyers. Then become promoted, and then they get together with their staff to talk about how to charge individual cases, whether to pursue death penalty, what to do, much more micro level, case level thinking, while they have not embraced the idea of the trends and then impact. So as what we are doing as part of our project also, we are trying to train prosecutors. Most recent training was in Philadelphia last week, which we're trying to train mid-level managers to also start thinking about the impact and linkage between the case level decision making as well as the trends. And if you don't have the both in front of you when you meet on a monthly basis to discuss how to prosecute cases, how to exit this COVID crisis, and where we want to be after we have the vaccine. Do we want to go back to 2019, or it's some new place that we want to go to? Right now, it's very hard to think about the big ideals when we have the tremendous backlog. But at the same time, now is the time to talk about these things and think about the trends and then impacts and where we want to be. So we're training the mid-level managers who have traditionally not embraced the idea of data, and who have often in many jurisdictions created the barriers. And I'm not talking about our partner jurisdictions, but traditionally mid-level managers are not the people who embrace the ideals of the reform as easily as newly elected prosecutors. So how can we sell them on the idea of the data? Then data are not going to be used to point the finger to a particular prosecutor or a judge and call them racist, but data are going to be used to give them additional tool in their toolbox, so they can start thinking about the linkage between the cases and then trends. So that's basically the overall training that we are also implementing. The most recent training focused on the relationship between case filing and dismissal, subsequent dismissal. And interestingly, what Kim was saying, it's somewhat different in what we're seeing in many other jurisdictions, where actually whites are less likely to have their cases dismissed, and blacks are more likely to have their cases dismissed. And it raises the questions of how are these cases filed and how thorough the screening was. And we have different models in different jurisdictions, where some jurisdictions do a much more thorough screening up front. And then once the file cases, there is a dismissal rate is slightly lower. We have other jurisdictions, they basically file more cases, and then their dismissal rate is slightly higher. And you would think there is a relationship between these two, and certainly there is a relationship. And I'm probably telling you based on the sample of the 20 or so jurisdictions that I've seen the data in some form of shape. But there are some jurisdictions that have relatively high rejection rate at filing, yet still very high dismissal rate. So it doesn't work that way. And so, while the purpose of the PPIs is not to compare one jurisdiction to another, but to compare data from 1 month to another and check trends over time, we are also using this as an opportunity to have discussions about what are the best case screening policies, what are the best divergent policies, how can we triangulate different outcomes? Because we know if we're changing one thing, there will be intended or unintended consequences for other things. And again, I'm not saying that we are amazing experts on this, but we're trying to build that culture where people are trying to become much more open to this idea of discussing data, and as such slowly starting to overcome what I like to call data phobia in the field of prosecution. That is still very strong. And we have more than 2,300 offices in this country, and the majority of the offices are not going to have the visionary prosecutor who is going to be convincing them about the ideals of the data, how data can be a friend as opposed to a foe. And we think about this every day, how we can scale our work to the other jurisdictions, how we can maybe build the work locally, where we can convince local community groups and then academic institutions to form meaningful researcher community prosecutorial partnerships, because it's very hard to have a model where you fly jurisdiction, you run the analysis and disappear. I think the most sustainable models are the ones where you build local capacity and people do this when you leave. So as part of this prosecutorial performance indicators, we are helping also build dashboards. Most recently, 2 dashboards appeared: Andrew Warren's dashboard, as well as Melissa Nelson's Hillsborough and Duval County dashboards in Florida. 2 dashboards that are first of a kind in our state, and will be redefining how new prosecutors and other prosecutors will be thinking about the data. Ironically, we are now talking to 2 other offices, large offices, to develop the dashboards in the state of Florida. I think slowly we are seeing the appetite for this work is growing. And I think largely thanks to the new visionary prosecutors. Credit also needs to go to the funders. Obviously, I will have to say that. But also community involvement and then pressure and is real and is a meaningful one. And I think communities are demanding the seat at the table, and slowly many of the community groups are getting the seat at the table. Melba is helping us now build a community engagement component. I don't know, Melba, if you're going to have a chance to talk about this at some point, but it's a very important part of it, as Aisha was saying. I think without having community insights into this process and some kind of advisory board or support structure, it may become just an internal office management tool as opposed to the tool that really embraces the community engagement ideals. And then one other thing I wanted to say, and Andrew and Kim both sort of alluded to this, we are doing the interviews of the prosecutors when we go to these offices. So especially when we have newly elected prosecutors, I think it's important to test the temperature. So we ask the line prosecutors, whom we select confidentially, and no one knows their name, whether they've been interviewed or what they told us. We have managed to secure their complete confidentiality in all 4 sites. And that's just not my preference. That's the law we're governed by. We cannot name anyone, and we are doing everything to secure individual prosecutors' confidentiality, because at the end of the day, we also believe that the problem is not the 1 or 2 prosecutors. Problem is the system. And, I think if we don't think about the policies we have, then systematic barriers we have to racial equity, sort of pointing finger to individual prosecutors is not going to solve that problem. So we sit at the table with these line prosecutors, and we ask questions about, how do you define success? At the end of the year, what makes you feel good about your performance at the individual level and as an office level? And then we want to see to what extent those goals, objectives, values, priorities align with those of the elected. We asked them very neutral question, and this neutral question still got us in a lot of trouble. Simple question: are there racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal justice system? Very neutral. Clearly, I'm a white guy, but it's often is perceived like we are going after somebody to start calling names. And you can see a lot of prosecutors becoming uncomfortable. Not necessarily what they say, but their body language changes. They cannot look at you. They're looking, away from you. And the discomfort of talking about the race is real. It's real. And, I'm not saying that we are able to teach them how to talk about the race, but I think we're able to break through initial barriers and start seeing that this is not only bad, there are some positive things associated with thinking about the race. Go ahead.
Let me pivot on this for a second, because you're making a really great point with regards to the fear and the reluctance to kind of have these frank discussions, and we juxtaposition that with the events of this summer, or, talking about racial justice and what should prosecution, criminal justice reform, what should our system look like going forward. But I want to take that and turn to Aisha for a second and ask her, based on, looking at your work at MacArthur and the Safety and Justice Challenge, it seems almost like a conflict where you have folks that are afraid to talk about racial justice, yet this work is happening. Where do you see the future of this type of work going? Do you think that more prosecutors' offices are going to embrace doing work through dashboards and being more transparent? Or do you think that discomfort might basically hold the movement back?
Oh, I have so many thoughts about that, because it's coming to me on different levels. But, as Beziki said, it's about culture change and culture shift. And I was struck when I was going through school for my MBA, that was the constant focus. It's about process improvement. That's the nature of the business. That was natural. But that was completely opposed to what, my work in government, which was stagnant and based on how it always been. And the reality is that in this country, the status quo is inequity, and it's a part of me even coming to this work. I had to come to grips with the things that I had done without realizing, being aligned with metrics that focused on convictions and long sentences, that I myself, as a Black woman contributed to racist outcomes. I had to come to grips with that. And, once we get past that name calling and finger pointing and the adversarial nature of the system and get to the larger culture shift of we should be focused on improving these inequities that are there. They're just there, and if we take responsibility for what we can do now, we can make a difference on that. And so, at the foundation, we're continuing to support the PPI project. It's an ongoing thing right now, as long as we have the Safety and Justice Challenge, which is time limited, but we have at least 4 more years. And the hope is to expand the project so more offices can be exposed to it. And the amazing work that the pilot jurisdictions have done have laid the foundation and proven that it's possible and it can be done. And so more and more sites are signing up for that. And so that is exciting.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Aisha. So we're going to move into question and answer since I see a very long list of questions submitted by the audience, which I'm so excited. I'm glad that y'all are really engaged and you're finding this interesting and stimulating. So, but let me give you the very important information with regards to getting your CLE credit. So the unique CLE code for this program is M as in Mary, I as in Iglesia, D as in David, C as in Charlie, L as in Larry, E as in Echo, 0 as in Oscar, 21803. So the code is MIDCLE 021803. Please write this code down and enter it in the CLE code box located under the media player on this session detail page, and then click submit. Once again, the CLE code for this program is MID-CLE 021803. You must enter this code in order to receive CLE credit for attending this program. All right, so now we're going to move into the question and answer session. Give me 1 second. Let me get there. Okay, so first off, can you say something about method of race and ethnicity data collection? If it's collected by the cops, is that done by observation? Have you developed a practice among the sites on how to collect this data? So I'm opening up for everybody. Whoever wants to take that question.
Andrew, you want to go first on this?
Sure. First of all, it's a fantastic question because it goes to the heart of how hard some of this is when we're talking about identifying racial disparities. Well, what does it mean to be a member of a certain race and where are we getting the data from? So we found that in our office, for example, we could have one defendant who had 5 cases and his race was listed 5 different times in our own case management system. We ended up relying on law enforcement data, but we were also using, as the research team suggested, identification of certain defendants as Latino or Hispanic based on their last names and whether, Betsky will correct me, I think 75% of people in the US Census with the same last name identify as that race. One of the issues with that is it fails to capture people whose name may have changed because of marriage, for example. And so the bottom line is the data is far from perfect on it, but we still think it presents a relatively accurate picture, at least in our office, because where we see some people may be excluded from the appropriate racial identification, we see over-inclusion and under-inclusion sort of balancing each other out when we have enough cases.
And if I may add to that, Melba, for a second, I think it's largely based in most of the jurisdictions where we worked, it's based on the police officer's identification or determination of the suspect's race. Then somebody is entered as the Asian and it becomes Asian for very often if there are even subsequent cases. We've been challenging this for a number of years now, at least a decade, but at times we also think that the perceived race for the study of racial disparities is probably as useful as the actual race. So if the police officer or a prosecutor views somebody being Black and makes the decisions based on the perception, that's what we want to know anyway. So in the ideal case, I think, in the ideal world of the research where you will have the both actual self-identified race as well as the race determined by the criminal justice practitioner. And first, we'll see how often those things match. But yeah, by no means we have perfect data.
Awesome. Thank you both. The next question, we have a large number of disparate Asian communities. Is there data regarding these same issues with Asian defendants?
Should I quickly answer that?
Go for it.
So unfortunately, in most jurisdictions that we don't have this large enough Asian population to do the analysis. There are some places like we worked in Manhattan DA's office where we have a sizable Asian population, and we did compare the treatment of Asians to whites and blacks and Latino, Hispanics. And so you see that the treatment of Asians generally more closely aligns with the treatment of whites. In many cases, actually, Asians are receiving the least punitive outcomes. In fact, our dear colleague Brian Johnson has devoted a couple of articles called the Model Minority, where he describes the sentencing for Asian defendants in various courts. So it depends on the size of the jurisdiction and then how large the Asian population is.
Great, thank you. Next question, what is the website for the dashboard and for the Cook County and Hillsborough County data? I will answer that. The website for the dashboard is www.Prosecutorial Performance Indicators, plural, indicators.org. And if you go to our website, you can then click on our partners, and that will link you to the Cook County and the Hillsborough County websites to be able to see the data. Also, see the final dashboards. Also, the resources, there's a resource page attached to this session. The resources are attached under supplemental files, and it's on the left-hand side of the session detail page for this program. So that's another way for you to be able to see the links and get to the links for all of the dashboards. Okay, the next question. Aisha mentioned data leveraged to avoid subjective policy based on anecdote. Civil rights advocates say categorization through data points like zip code seem innocuous, but can really be racially biased. How do you promote data in objective ways while also avoiding promoting detrimental biases? And that's open to everyone.
I'll go. I mean, I think we recognize as Bezeki had talked about, some of the limitations of data and some of where data can be very fraught, particularly, again, when people use it in this perceived race neutral way that can have these impacts. And I think what this project is allowing us to do is, one, we recognize the imperfection of it. And again, the work that we're doing is around an intentionality of looking at the disparate impacts of our decisions and the outcomes as it affects race. And so we know, I know there's a lot of conversation, particularly as we're embracing bail reform here in Cook County and a risk assessment tool that takes data, and we know some of the inherent issues related to the data that's inputted into those risk assessment tools and the unintended consequences on communities of color. Like, that is all recognized as some of the gray zones of data. But I think what this project has told us is that you've got to get into it and as we start doing more of this work and start looking at more research and recognizing some of those potential areas where we're learning more. Every year, the basis of knowledge grows, where you're able to identify some of these pitfalls that are there. But I think from our vantage point, it's starting with we recognize that we have disparate outcomes. How do we draw the line backwards to see where our decision points have been that have led to that? How do we start asking the questions related to the outcome that changes our policy perspective? But again, very much cognizant that data is imperfect, that there are unintended consequences of some of this type of work, and being very intentional about addressing that. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, I'm a lawyer, I'm a prosecutor. I am not a researcher. And so having Bezeki and FIU and Don Steeman and Loyola working with us on this work to be able to see some of those traps, to be able to call for that, to be able to identify those areas is really, really invaluable. And doing this work as a prosecutor's office, it has been linked, inextricably with academia. And I think that's one of the things that we haven't really talked about in this conversation too, is not only the hesitancy that prosecutors' offices have had around sharing data and information and what does that look like, but also kind of this notion that we know it all, that you don't know what it's like unless you've done this work, to be able to work in partnership with research institutions, with academics, to be able to pose questions and think in a mindset that is very different than the work that we do on the day-to-day. And so one of the things that I try to encourage my colleagues across the country is having that arm, having that academic and research arm as a part of the work that you do in your office yields so much better outcomes or innovation. I think this is also an exercise in innovation, how to think differently and how to look at solutions or come about solutions from different angles. And so those are things that we are mindful of, but I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the incredible work of our academic partners in this effort, who have the foresight and knowledge to be able to help us identify some of those areas which may not be easily seen to the prosecutor's eye.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. So next question, and the questions are coming in fast and furious, just so everyone knows. All right, so this one should be interesting. So how do you suggest to practically change the prosecutor's decisions? Are you suggesting a racially based quota they cannot exceed in lieu of considering the criminality of the accused conduct? How does this further a system where justice ought to be blind? Now, I don't think anybody is suggesting that we need to have a quota, because nothing good really comes out of a quota. But I pivot to the panel to share your thoughts.
Yeah, let me jump in on that one, Melba. First of all, that's our website for our data. So someone handed that to me. It fell from the sky as we were talking, but. So it's a really good question, and Melba started to address the answer. We're not trying to dictate to attorneys what they do in an individual case based on, oh, we're being too harsh on this class of people, or we're not filing charges enough on this class. It's really the opposite. It's what are systemic factors coming in that lead to systemic disparities aside from individual prosecutorial decision-making. So for example, one of the things we noticed in our office was we dismiss a high rate of charges in cases where victims are Black. And we thought, okay, well, why is that happening? It's certainly not because prosecutors are making that decision based on the race of the victim, but we immediately had some thoughts about why that's happening. Is it because the cases that we're charging against Black defendants are of a different nature? And we looked at that. We're looking at whether there is something in sort of the no snitching culture that leads to cases being more difficult to prosecute within a certain type of case where where a victim is of one race versus another. So it's not that the data is saying, no, you have to handle this case in a certain way. It's more identifying these larger, broader problems of this is an issue in our office. And to use that example again, why is it that we have a higher dismissal rate for cases where defendants are Black, and how do we go about addressing that? Sometimes the solutions are in our office with what we're doing. Sometimes the solutions, frankly, rest outside our office, but it's still our responsibility to find them.
And I would say I agree wholeheartedly that no, this is not geared towards being prescriptive of how we handle cases. I think it is to the point that was made earlier that it's not even just looking at the disparities. It is how do we measure our effectiveness as prosecutors? How do we define what success looks like? And I keep pivoting back to something Aisha said in the beginning, but it is the thing that I often thought about as a line assistant a lot of my success and promotion was related to a conviction. It was related to a specified outcome. And if you are driven by that, then it may be you have a case that you might throw out because I might not be able to, it might be hard, but I don't know if I'll be able to win it. And so I'm just going to not even try because you're driven by, I want to be 100%. Or you might pursue a case that may otherwise be dealt with diversion or some other alternative, but you want to be able to get it because it's a slam dunk. And it's not about what is the best outcome for that case, for that victim, for that individual, but what is the best outcome for you as the line assistant? And I'm just going to be honest that is some of the calculations that prosecutors, particularly young prosecutors, where the incentive structures were based upon your performance as opposed of what is the most appropriate outcome, you get these types of disparities. And it's not the things that we often talk about, but it's a reality. Lots of prosecutors and officers were getting promotion based on the number of convictions that they had done, the number of trials that they had done. And if that is your incentive structure, you may then see some of this show up in other areas and in those disparities. And so it is not meant to be prescriptive. When we do talk about justice supposing to be blind, what this has allowed for us to do is actually demonstrate that it's not, and to stop the false illusion that it is, so that we don't continue behaviors that perpetuates that. And the question, again, I go back to, this allows us to ask a series of questions. It's not even just in charging decisions. It is for us when we talk about prosecutor performance indicators. How do we evaluate prosecutors? What does our evaluation tool look like? Are we asking on our evaluation tool, how you exercise discretion in offering diversion? Are we asking, what is your engagement with community? Or are we just asking about numbers of trials? And then what does that then look like? What are we incentivizing? And so again, I think this project has been really instructive in allowing us to continue to ask questions and delve deeper versus giving us a prescription for how we should handle cases. I mean, that's not what this has ever been about, but it has allowed for us to think more critically and thoughtfully about all of the decisions that we make along the continuum, with that on our mindset of making sure that we're addressing race with real intentionality, that we aren't having these unintended consequences or outcomes because we haven't been intentional about looking for them.
Great, thank you so much for that.
And Melba, if I could just add really briefly, because Kim makes such a good point in response. There are metrics that we're looking at that have nothing to do with defendants, for example. How well does our office interact with victims and keep victims apprised as to what's going on in the case? We're supposed to be working with victims. In Florida, they have a statutory, now a constitutional right to be involved. Are we upholding that right? Are we complying with our discovery obligations? We can win case after case after case, but if we are flirting with violating a defendant's constitutional rights by not providing timely discovery, we are not doing our job as prosecutors. So there are metrics here that have nothing to do with charging, sentencing, prosecuting in terms of a defendant-focused view that goes to how well we're doing our jobs as prosecutors.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Next question, because there's a lot happening. Next question is from our dear friend, Wayne McKenzie, who did work with Besicki at the Vera Institute. He says, has sent his greetings, while race is the four-letter word of prosecution and criminal justice, and prosecutors are primarily elected officials, how can one use data to help build political capital?
I'll go, hey, Wayne. I think when we talked about this a little earlier, when you see what's been happening in our country in the last 7 months in the wake of the death of George Floyd, The conversation about race and justice is not just happening here at FI. It's in the streets. It's in the advocacy. It's in, communities. Like I said, when I came into office in 2016, there was a real desire to understand what is happening with our criminal justice system as it relates to these communities that have been impacted. And so from a political capital standpoint, I think you are absolutely aloof or not connected to what's happening in the moment if you don't address these issues. And if there is the belief that, oh, well, we've gotten past this moment, the marches have ended, the hashtags are done, that we're not going to see ourselves back here. If we don't do this, you're wrong. I mean, it doesn't even take the arc of like the history to look at like 50 years. I'm just talking about in the last 10, whether it's related to Mike Brown or Tamir Rice or Eric Garner, Laquan McDonald to now George Floyd. Like, these issues are not singular to those who have been murdered that have brought criminal justice to the forefront. There is an underlying current in many of our communities around a distrust of our criminal justice system because of the impact on race. And so from a political cover standpoint, it's not even cover, it is being responsive to the communities that you serve by being transparent, first and foremost, having these measures public so people can see them, so that they can start to ask the questions, and being accountable to the communities that you serve. Now, some people aren't data hacks where they're like, oh, I'm going to go look and see how Fox is doing there. But the availability of it, and our saying, we want to come show you, we want to be engaged with you, we want you to hold us to account. Because from a political standpoint, my job is by the people of Cook County who put me in this office. And so I owe them answers to how we do this work. And so as discomforting as these conversations are, I cannot for a moment lose that I am only in this seat as a result of advocacy on the streets that had very little to do that it was me in this seat, but a persistent distrust of our criminal justice system and the way that it treated communities like the one I grew up in, and a demand for change. And I think in the 4 years since Andrew and I, first came into office, we came in the same year, we've seen in prosecutor space more and more prosecutors who've embraced transparency, who've embraced this holistic approach, who've talked about the overly punitive nature of the criminal justice system. You've seen, in Boston, for example, a debate for the Boston DA when Rachel Rollins was running in the Suffolk County Jail. I'm looking at the race in Manhattan for the Manhattan DA's race, and the talk about mass incarceration and decarceration. I don't know about you, Andrew. I feel like I wasn't hearing a lot of that 4 years ago, and it was revolutionary. What we were talking about then, it is now becoming more normative now, and the expectation from the public that you will be different than the generation before. That is now a common expectation. It's asking prosecutors, what are you going to look at? How are you going to address the racial disparities in the justice system? How are you going to address issues of mass incarceration? How are you going to address over punitiveness? Those are questions that weren't asked 4 years ago that are right now. I've seen it on many, political questionnaires that are being asked of prosecutors today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Kim. All right, so we have a couple more and 11 minutes. So let's see if we can do some rapid fire. All right, regarding data, data is used to assess current conditions. Doesn't data at best provide an estimate of conditions at a time certain in the past? How can it be quantified for a more accurate estimate of current conditions? Let's kind of do a lightning round on this one. So 2-minute answer, anyone?
Our dashboard is live, living, and so we're not just looking at data from 2-3 years ago, as Andrew said. We're now looking at our data. We've looked at data from our predecessor, but it is a live, living document that we are continuing in all aspects, again, from mid-level management to our policy folks. And so, yes, it captures time, but you're able to capture trends, and those trends are the things that we're trying to address.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question. Do PPIs analyze the end result of criminal fraud in the inner city versus the same criminal fraud on Wall Street? Inner city individual defendants will wind up with a prosecution and conviction, and Wall Street individual defendants will receive a pass on prosecution and never brought to trial. Besseke, I think you might be best suited to answer this one. 2 minutes or so.
I think you are well suited to answer that one, Melba.
No, you, Besseke, because I've got to make sure the rest of these questions are.
No, listen, I completely, Andrew.
I used to prosecute the guys on Wall Street. So, but actually the data that we have, one of the metrics we're looking at is the zip code of the defendant. So it doesn't, perfectly capture Wall Street versus Main Street, but it does allow us to look at defendants based on their socioeconomic background, based on where they live, to see if we're being consistent. So great question. And absolutely, that's a metric we're looking at.
And the same by defense counsel type, right?
Yeah, we're definitely doing defense counsel type as well, because that sheds a lot of light, as well as also looking at zip codes to make sure that there's no disparities happening based on where people are from. See if I can squeeze 3 more lightning round questions in. Our courts are far behind expected calendars due to COVID-19. What do you anticipate as problems and solutions when early, hang on, the questions literally disappeared on me. Hold that thought. Here we go. All right, we're back. All right, our courts are far behind expected calendars due to COVID-19. What do you anticipate as problems and solutions when early efforts in data management encounter an unprecedented backlog? I know that's definitely weighing heavily on everybody's mind right now.
I unmuted to shrug out loud. Listen, these are truly unprecedented times. We recognize that the backlog in Cook County, we still aren't fully functioning, is going to be problematic. The good thing about the things that we've learned, if we've been able to do a lot remote. And so the work that we've been doing on our dashboards, on our data management has been able to be done remotely. But I think the coming months, as courts start to open up, as more people are able to get back out, will be a very challenging time that will stress our court systems in ways that we haven't seen before. Solutions, I think, are taking what we've learned in the wake of COVID, remote hearings, being able to really truly be a 21st century court system are some of the things that I think will help us get through this. But it will be an incredibly stressful time on all of our systems.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question. Prosecutors are often portrayed as being police-centric and therefore biased. Since prosecutors prosecute cases law enforcement brings to them, how can the use of prosecutorial data be used to effect better policing and to project prosecutorial neutrality?
I mean, you want to talk about prosecutors and law enforcement. Yeah, we generally have a good working relationship, but my police chief went on national television and criticized me for decisions I'd made when we didn't prosecute people who were peacefully protesting. So I do think that there is an inherent partnership between law enforcement and prosecutors, but we're supposed to be independent. And when we're focused on data-driven solutions, hopefully law enforcement shares our view of what the goal should be. And they go beyond simply prosecuting as many people as possible to obtain the longest sentences possible for everyone who comes through the system. And when you get law enforcement to share in the goals of standing up for victims and using resources efficiently and not being overly punitive and preventing crime, then the data is a way to make us all embrace those goals and to find solutions for them.
Awesome. Anyone else have anything to add on that last question?
My police chief went on TV too, Andrew. It's okay. And I think the way that you combat that is, Andrew's absolutely right. We're independent offices. And I think historically, there was not much daylight. There was kind of a sense that, you know, if it was brought to us, we prosecute it. Again, one of the things that we've been able to see as a result of the PPIs is, you know, in Cook County, we don't charge drug cases are direct filed by police departments. We don't review those cases. So when we were looking at the PPIs, we saw that we were upside down in the number of cases that we were dismissing after charging, largely drug cases, because our office's position was that we weren't using resources to do that. That then changes the behavior of the policing department, that if we're not prosecuting these cases, they're getting dismissed, then we shouldn't make those arrests in the first place. And so I think there is an opportunity when we are able to use the data, when we're able to exert that independence unapologetically, to be able to change some of the policing practices as well, and using data to assist in doing that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. The last question I'm going to pose for today. Can you comment on whether the courts at your sites are participating or engaging in this data collection? Are they partners? And are you seeing more data collection in the courts?
I'll go quickly. I think one of the best things about being able to put your data out there is that it puts pressure on other stakeholders to do the same, because then there becomes an expectation that, you know, well, if they can do it, you can too. The other thing is, we were using a lot of data that we pulled from our case management system, that some of the courts, for example, the judges were like, well, that's not accurate. And we said, well, perhaps you should share yours so that we can ensure the greatest level of accuracy. And so in the course of the last 4 years, we've gotten a number of memorandums of understanding to be able to get other stakeholders to pull their data together. And so we report on our own data, but here in Cook County, I am really pleased at the level of data sharing that has happened with our stakeholder partners in this area.
Andrew, do you have anything to add on that?
Yes, so our judges in our courts really haven't shared in the data collection or putting out data, and I'm not sure exactly what data they could put out.
We did. We actually.
Yeah, I mean, we have a fair amount of data that's collected by our state agency that oversees the courts, that puts out in broad strokes, you know, the number of cases and the types of crimes, et cetera. But I'll tell you, one of the things that's happened from the data project is there's been a push in the state of Florida to increase data collection in the criminal justice system. Back in 2018, the state of Florida passed a law requiring data to be collected and maintained, and the state attorney's offices had to start giving our Florida Department of Law Enforcement information that was supposed to be put out to the public. So this project has inspired not just a conversation, but action around being transparent with regard to the criminal justice system, so that the communities we serve can actually look at what we're doing and draw their own conclusions about whether we're doing what's right.
Awesome. Wow, with that being said, we are literally with 1 minute to go. So I want to take this opportunity, number one, to thank all of the amazing panelists who have joined us this afternoon, sharing their time, their wisdom, their experiences. Definitely want to thank the American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section and the amazing folks behind the scenes like Carol, Rose, and Stephanie, and all the great folks that toil day to day to make this happen for us. So thank you again. Also, the CLE information, just in case you need that CLE credit, the code is basically MID, as in mid-year, mid-CLE 021803. Mid-CLE 021803. Just pivoting to the panelists for one last time, if you'd like to share contact information for people to get a hold of you, please feel free. I believe my email should be in the materials, but I'm going to give you that minute if you want to give either a closing thought or contact information for people to contact you.
I'm at cookcountystatesattorney.org. I'm looking for my sheet of paper to come from the sky like Andrews, but I don't have that here in Chicago, so it's cookcountystatesattorney.org.
When all else fails, paper for the win. Aisha, Besiki?
Yeah, well, if you Google for the Safety and Justice Challenge, you can get to the information about the site and find me that way through the MacArthur Foundation. I also added a couple links that will be put in the supplemental resource materials to include in a panel from last week about that ISLG announcement, some of our performance data for the first phase of the initiative, and some work that highlight the work that we've been doing. So that's available to folks as well.
And all the reports that we discussed, including racial disparity reports, the dashboards, our contact information, this is all available through the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators.org. It's also included in the supplemental files. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I see we had about 250 strong for this panel. So again, thank you so much for your time, for willing to be educated about this topic and for joining us today, and have a wonderful day. Bye everyone.